Welcome to Independent Women's Forum. And we are going to have a discussion today with Sohrab Ahmari. He's the opinion editor at the New York Post. So first of all, welcome, Sohrab. Thanks for taking the time to discuss this incredibly important issue. I think whether you're a Post fan, as I am, or not, I think this is an incredibly disturbing development to discuss. So let's just go through, just to start off with, what actually happened. What story did you publish? What did you tweet that got your account locked for 2 weeks? A major U.S. newspaper had its account locked for 2 weeks right before the election. What did you do to make Jack Dorsey mad?
So first of all, thank you for having me. And I just want to make one thing clear. Over the past 2 weeks, as we've had this big battle with big tech, I've sort of emerged as one of the faces of the New York Post because I've been advocating for our journalism and against the censorship that we've been subjected to. But just to be very clear, I had nothing to do with the reporting and editing of the stories that led to this, and I'll kind of get into the details of that as well, and nor the kind of decision making of how we dealt with Facebook or Twitter. So all I was doing was sort of publicly advocating, but not involved either in the reporting and writing and editing, nor the kind of decision making behind the scenes. That all that credit goes to people who are not Twitter loudmouths, but they're my colleagues and deserve all the credit. So I just want to get that out of the way. So basically it's like October 14th, about 2 weeks ago, the New York Post published a bombshell story. It hit online at 5 a.m, and it was a cache of emails, as most people now know, recovered from a hard drive apparently belonging to Hunter Biden. All along, we were clear of how we got that hard drive, and I will repeat it here. He apparently dropped it. He or someone he related to him, an associate, dropped it off with a laptop repair shop guy in Delaware, never picked it up, never paid for the repairs. And so that person assumed what legally is called constructive ownership. And he looked through it and noticed there was, let's say, interesting stuff on it. So he contacted the FBI and eventually relinquished the hard drive to the FBI. But before he did that, he made a copy, and he gave that copy to Rudy Giuliani's lawyer. We then, in the right-wing sphere, rumor spread that such a hard drive existed. We heard about it through Mr. Steve Bannon. And again, none of my doing, but my colleagues. And then we basically reached out to Mr. Giuliani, pressed him for it, and he was kind enough to give it to us. And then we meticulously reported, among other things, the first story we did was the fact that Hunter Biden, while he was sitting on the board of a Ukrainian energy firm called Burisma, and getting paid at least $50,000 a month for it, despite not exactly being an expert on natural gas or Ukrainian or Eastern European energy affairs. And while his father was vice president of the United States, Hunter had apparently arranged a meeting between his father and executives from Burisma. And there was an email from one Burisma executive thanking Hunter for having made that possible. So this is a perfectly kind of public interest story. 3 weeks before an election, it sort of didn't work in the favor of one candidate.
And many stories have on both sides.
On both sides.
Over the course of several months. This is campaign 101, right?
Exactly. But what I would say is that it was more solidly corroborated than lots of stories that we saw over the past 4 years. I mean, this had kind of hard evidentiary basis of the emails, which neither Hunter Biden nor Joe Biden disputed the authenticity of the emails, neither disputed the ownership of the laptop. So just to be clear, and they still have not 2 weeks later. Nevertheless, so we published this at 5 a.m. because I'm not on the news side, I'm on the opinion side. I actually just heard about it when everyone else did. And then at 10 a.m, the first inklings of censorship to come actually came not from Twitter, but from Facebook. Andy Stone, a communication staffer for Facebook, who it also happens is a former longtime Democratic Party activist and operative, has worked for Senator Barbara Boxer of California, has worked for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So Andy Stone tweeted, although he works for Facebook, just to be clear, he tweeted that I will not, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I won't post that horrible New York Post story. But needless to say, it deserves to be fact-checked. And in the meanwhile, we're going to take steps to reduce circulation on the story on our platform. So that was Facebook. Now, again, unprecedented, because there have been so many stories over the past 4 years that were not verified and actually collapsed under factual scrutiny the way our story never did, but nevertheless were not censored on Facebook. Then I think, from my experience, about an hour later, I tried to tweet our own story, like I would, and I got a warning message saying I can't post this. And then we later learned that people couldn't even share it in private messages, which is sinister and creepy that Facebook can do that. I'm sorry, Twitter can do that. And the reason I sort of became the public face of it is I just tweeted, I'm an editor at the New York Post, America's oldest continuously published daily, founded by Alexander Hamilton, all true, and I can't tweet one of our own stories. And that tweet sort of got retweeted 100,000 times or something like that. And then we've had this ongoing battle with Twitter for about 2 weeks because they also locked our account, claiming that this was in violation of their hacked materials policy, and also was material that was disclosed without the authorization of the subject of the story. Now, first of all, on the hack thing, this was never hacked material. This was a recovered laptop, which is something else. And the person who owned the laptop, it was by then the laptop repair shop owner under what's called, again, constructive ownership. And second of all, if the standard for allowing stories to circulate on social media is that the subjects of the story approve of them, then we would have no journalism. The Pentagon Papers would have to have been banned. The reporting on the torture at Abu Ghraib prison would have to have been banned. Any number of stories, the only stories that would be allowed on social media, if that were a consistent standard, would be public relations, because that's the only case in which the subject of a story approves of the message. So we held on for 2 weeks because Twitter kept pressuring us to delete 6 tweets that were promoting these stories. And they were saying, okay, we're going to change our policy. From now on, only the hacker will be barred from posting hacked material, not a third party. Now, we insist this was not hacked material, to be very clear, but that was a policy change. Nevertheless, they said, we won't allow the New York Post to take advantage of this policy change retroactively. So we insist that you delete your original tweets, and then you will gain access to your account again, and then you can retweet the exact same things. And we refused to do that. And then after about 2 weeks of public pressure, including from lawmakers on Capitol Hill and us as we're going on TV and sounding the alarm about the censorship, on Friday, I believe, Facebook just relented. And so we regained access to our account without having to do any of that. So that's the story in a nutshell. I'm sorry that took longer than I had planned, but I think it's a good overview.
Yeah, no, I think it's very relevant information, and so important, because so many other both institutions and individuals have faced this, but they weren't able to go on Tucker, right? They weren't able to broadcast. The New York Post is a huge institutional newspaper, and it has access to fight back in a way that a lot of other people will not. I mean, I know IWF, we've had some of our graphics censored by Facebook, even posting data from the CDC about COVID that has been taken down, or we had a request to change our infographics on it from Facebook. So it's a much larger problem that I think you got all this attention because finally it was an institution that had so much reach and power that it was able to make. You guys were able to make this a big story, in some ways bigger than the original Hunter Biden laptop story. The fact that these tech companies, obviously unelected, they're private companies, were really impacting an election and impacting a story that was bad for one candidate. And I think that rightly worried a lot of people. So Jack Dorsey testified, the CEO of Twitter, he testified last week in front of Congress. Did you learn anything from that? That was when you were still locked, or the New York Post was still locked. Did you learn anything from that, or other than the fact that Jack Dorsey now looks like Rasputin come back to life?
Yeah, I call him Rasputin/hobo because of the beard. I don't know what's going on.
Yes, but besides that, did you learn anything relevant that feed into your decision not to delete your tweet the way that Jake Tapper encouraged the New York Post to do?
So again, I had nothing to do with our decision not to delete. So that was taken at a different level in the paper internally, and I wasn't in on it. But what I can tell you personally, look, all I heard over and over was basically, these are our private terms of service. We're a private company, so, and we're very clear about our terms, even though, as many lawmakers pointed out, and Senator Cruz, we found especially satisfying and gratifying because he just ripped into Dorsey and said, who the hell elected you, Mr. Dorsey? And we enjoyed that. But they stuck to their guns and their talking points. I think the only thing that was revelatory from our point of view, and which we harped on afterward, and again, we're grateful for lawmakers for pressing them on that, is that they both, Jack Dorsey, the Twitter CEO, and Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook CEO, were asked point blank, when you did it, or now, it was when you took the decision to censor the New York Post, or even still, do you have any evidence that this was in fact hacked material? And Dorsey sort of mumbled no, and Zuckerberg sort of mumbled no. So it was vindication for us, because it showed that we were being held, that a policy was being held against us that we hadn't even violated before. And now that they had changed the policy, the locking of our account was even more unjust. So that was what really stood out to me, was their admission, which is pretty damning, is that they locked us out of our account for doing something they didn't even have any evidence that we had done. He said this is not hacked material. Then why was the New York Post blocked from their Twitter account? Well, he just mumbled some jabbering nonsense. And then he said, well, what evidence do you have now that it's hacked? If you didn't know back then, he still had no evidence. So that was, I think, the most useful part of the hearing for us, was just the bare fact that, even if there was an original policy against hacked material, we hadn't even violated that.
Right. And I obviously, this is speculative, but then it really does raise the specter of just personal political conviction, right? If the stories that they were giving, first of all, Facebook and Twitter gave very different stories as to why they limited the spread of this story. And it really starts to then become credulous, right? That this is only happening in one direction, and that it has nothing to do with the left-wing views of, for example, these CEOs like Jack Dorsey, who donated $10 million to Ibram X. Kennedy's anti-racism project, right? It starts to become less and less credible the more different stories are being given, or when they admit in front of Congress that they didn't have any evidence that this was hacked. But you mentioned some politicians who sort of went to bat for you in that hearing. But I know you've also been critical of Republicans as a whole, or perhaps conservatives as a whole, for not seeking more political solutions to this problem. I mean, Section 230 has been mentioned. Josh Hawley was on Rising with Sagar and Jetty this morning, and he raised the idea of monopoly or antitrust. I mean, what do you think are the political solutions to this censorship problem?
So just to back up just a little bit, and I just want to explain why it was important for us not to delete those tweets, even though it was not my decision. Just want to make this point in 30 seconds. Because if we had deleted those tweets, for the rest of the New York Post's existence on Earth, and forever may it continue, our critics would say, the New York Post, the newspaper that was forced to delete 6 of their tweets under fact-checking scrutiny from Twitter, every time it would be in every CNN, New York Times, whatever story, right after our name in sort of M dashes. So that was one reason I think I was very annoyed when, so many reporters and editors didn't stand with us. Not only did they not speak out in solidarity with their fellow colleagues at another publication, some of them actively cheered for the censorship. And you saw, is it Bo Erickson of CBS dare to ask Mr. Biden about some of this reporting, and his news editor said, I'm offended that you asked that question. You should have just asked him what it feels like to be the victim of Russian disinformation, or something like that. So just the silence of so many of our colleagues, with some notable exceptions, who all happen to be kind of left-wing, actually independent journalists, Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, who have been just solid with us in solidarity, saying this is wrong. So I just want to set that aside, why we didn't delete, and just to praise those 2 guys who who don't align with us ideologically, but saw how alarming this was. As for the political solution, look, I mean, I think we can get very philosophical about this, but I would maybe just start with the practical fact of it, which is that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is the governing law, was enacted in the 1990s. And it was premised on the idea that these platforms are more like bulletin boards. People come, they post whatever they want, and therefore do not bear the liabilities of a publisher. If we at the New York Post publish, let's say, libelous material, we can be taken to court for libel or defamation. But Congress carved out a sort of special status for the likes of Twitter and Facebook, although neither platform was in existence back then, that said, you get to censor prurient material and pornography, hence the Communications Decency Act, even though you are going to be treated not as a publisher, but as a bulletin board. But now, I guess, 25 years after the fact, we just see that law, or as it's currently interpreted, you'd say either the law itself or how it's been interpreted, is not adequate to the reality of how these platforms are acting. Twitter and Facebook don't act like neutral bulletin boards. First of all, the way, and we can get into this, but the way that your newsfeed works is increasingly sort of subject to algorithmic machine learning. Most of it is just based on their profit motive. They want you to see certain things on top of other things. But that has a political dimension too, and it can be politicized. So for example, that's how Facebook reduced circulation on our story. They have machine learning mechanisms that were, without even taking human action, certain kinds of stories show up dead last on your newsfeed. So people open up their Facebook page and they think, well, I'm just getting a chronological account of what my friends have posted on Facebook. That's not true. It's catered to you. It's curated by a machine, but a machine that can be politically programmed. And they have a worldview. If you open your Twitter account, usually Twitter promotes its own stories. And these are framed in a very kind of clearly editorial way. So, when our first story first came out, they said, no evidence that Biden had any role in, this was Twitter saying so, not any other outlet. Twitter itself saying no evidence that Biden had a role in the firing of this Ukrainian prosecutor who was hounding his son's energy firm. That's a worldview. That's a story that Twitter itself is telling the way a publisher would. And so it has a worldview that it puts forward, and then it acts like a censor, as it did with the New York Post, as it has now with someone from the department, a senior official from the Department of Homeland Security that got banned when they put warnings on President Trump's tweets and so forth. So all I'm saying is a very practical realization is that if you want to act like a platform, I apologize. If you want to act like a publisher, go ahead and accept the publisher's responsibility. And so either the Section 230 needs to be reinterpreted, as Chairman Ajit Pai of the Federal Communications Commission wants to do, or Congress needs to take action so that the law reflects the reality of what we live in, because the current situation doesn't work. It's manifestly unfair that I or you, when you write for the American Mind, or I write for First Things or New York Post or wherever, I have to be careful not to libel people, and that's the role. And the publications that publish me have to be careful that what I say is not libelous. So if Twitter and Facebook are going to act the same way as a New York Post or a First Things or a Federalist or a Claremont Institute or what have you, then they should be subject to the same liability exposure as any other publisher. Just very quickly, I think the more philosophical case for why we need kind of political action has to do with my, it's an ongoing theme in my work, which is that political conservatives in this country for about 2 generations have been obsessed with distinguishing between quote unquote private versus public tyranny. If government does something, that's tyranny, and we're very good at detecting it and combating it. But if a private company does it, then it's no longer tyranny. Well, as you know, in classical thought, most sort of Greco-Roman political thought is geared towards restraining private tyranny. First of all, that is a real thing. And the formal distinction between public and private kind of doesn't matter if you're a journalist being censored by Twitter. It doesn't make you feel any better about the Republic if someone tells you, well, it's a private company that silenced Alexander Hamilton's own newspaper. who cares? It's tyrannical. And so, and all politics is architectonic. So there's no space in which you say, well, this is a private space in which they can be political without being subject to political pressure. If they're going to be political, they're going to have to be subject to public political pressure. But that's the more philosophical argument, I think.
Before I push back a little bit, I do want to sort of put a pin in the question of public versus private tyranny. We can return to that in just a minute. But just to push back a little bit, so one, of course, you have the libertarian objection that these are, because they're private actors, they have their own First Amendment rights. They have their own, if they want to cultivate a news feed, and they want to show users sort of a particular worldview, then that should be their right. So that's the libertarian objection. And then,
but their immunity from liability is an invention of 1990s legislative action. It's not something built into the. If CDA 230 weren't there, they would be subject to any liability that we would be. And so all we're saying is just level the playing field. It's not it doesn't go against the First Amendment, saying, look, if you're a publisher, why do some actors on the market have to face extra liability pressure than others?
So I think this feeds into my second sort of perhaps skepticism, right? I see. I'll just kind of lay my cards on the table. Then I'm, as you know, I'm an education policy wonk, and maybe I see everything too much through the lens of education, just because that's what I do, and we all think our sort of areas of study are the most important thing. But I guess I'm skeptical of some of these solutions, partially because I don't think the problem here is so much business monopoly as it is sort of a monoculture, a monopoly on culture, that the vast majority of people going into certain white collar professions, like the engineers who are building these algorithms, like the people who work at Google, Twitter. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I know these folks. There is a monoculture that is produced by the fact that our K-12 system teaches sort of a leftist, I would say, view of the world in sometimes a softer way and sometimes increasingly a harder way, with the introduction of critical race theory and 1619 and all of that into our K-12 systems. Then they go off to university and potentially a master's, and they spend all that time in universities. We both know, and everyone at this point knows, that the universities are far left. The academy is far left. And so I guess what I see is maybe we're struggling as conservatives to deal with the downstream effects of not just in tech companies, but generally in the Fortune 500 of a elite class or a sort of ruling class that goes into the top positions in all kinds of private fields, now having this very far left worldview that sees conservatives or Republicans not just as opponents within a republic to be debated with and to be convinced, but as enemies, as immoral people, as racists, as terrible bigots, right? I see that culture as driving this as much as anything else. So how would some of those political solutions that you advocate for help us push back against that culture? Because I think that's ultimately the real underlying problem here.
Right. So I'll address two questions, because I see in the chat Heather Higgins asks, how does restoring publisher liability solve the problem of silencing? So basically, it would raise the cost of them acting like publishers. If they're going to do, in effect, act like the New York Post does in selecting certain worldviews and favoring some over the others, then by being that they should be treated as publishers, and that means that they could be sued for any number of things. So in a way, it's a way to squeeze them and punish them coercively by the federal government for this behavior in a way that's perfectly, by the way, consistent with the First Amendment, because there's no First Amendment right to being immune from liability for what's published on your, I would say, not platform, but your website or whatever you want to call it. But to answer your question, it has I think that's part of this widens the discussion to much more than maybe we have room for. But I think I'm also open and see the necessity of addressing education. And I think in more aggressive ways than I think previous administrations have been willing to do than compared to this administration. For example, its decision to suggest that teaching critical race theory could put your federal funding at risk. Or it does things like when Princeton Princeton says we've been guilty of systematic racism, the Department of Education says, "Oh, really? Okay, let's investigate you." So I was just saying,
that's been my favorite news story this year.
In a really horrible year. So, basically, my point is that you're right that's part of why this happens. I did as it happens, I have a former Facebook insider, who's been giving me a lot of information, some of which I've published, some of which I haven't gone into yet. But so he shows me sort of internal chats among Facebook employees, and they're so hard left. And what's painful about it is that they're all sort of highly paid, $300,000, $400,000 a year salaries engineers, and yet they're cheering for rioting, which doesn't ever affect people who live in those kinds of neighborhoods in Menlo Park or whatever. It damages bodegas owned by low-income minority small businesses, and so this becomes a bit digressive. But my point was that you're definitely right that it's partly a cultural thing, but I would argue that cultural phenomena are not autonomous and separate from politics. Again, to go back to Aristotle, the political science is the architectonic science, and politics is the art that shapes every other art. So it's no sort of cultural solution. If you want a culture of a certain kind, as Cicero tells us, as Aristotle tells us, you have to also change the law, because the law shapes culture. The law teaches people. And so if you have a law that punishes certain kinds of behavior, people will shift their own incentives. And something I've always argued before conservatives is not to be afraid of using government, is that you think, but people are against us. The masses are against us right now. Don't worry about it. Okay. Most people, when you change the law, they'll begin to change their behavior along with it, and they won't even remember that they held the contrary position like 2 weeks ago. So people respond to coercion. People respond to I'd say coercion, legitimate authoritative coercion in the interest of the good. That's all of Western political thought, that people respond to that. And so, these are political realms, is all I'm saying. And if conservatives want to play small ball, they can just tell themselves that they're not political, they're cultural or economic, and pretend that politics is this separate thing that happens in Congress with people wearing suits and slamming gavels. Or they can meet reality that the political pervades everything, and therefore, if you want conservative ends, you should seek political solutions.
So that's a philosophical discussion that could go on forever, but I know that you have an end point here where you're going to have to regrettably say goodbye. But before you do, I did want to ask you about both the foreign national argument or angle to this, right? You published under your own byline from some of those Facebook sources you just mentioned, the fact that Facebook was employing Chinese nationals to do some of its algorithmic censoring work. Obviously, in China, the CCP, the Communist Party, has created a social credit system by which all kinds of positive aspects of society, whether that's travel or getting a good job or some kind of social award, is tied to a social credit score that is largely premised on falling in line with the line of the Chinese Communist Party, right? And they've done that through the government. Now, the First Amendment probably protects us from a lot of that here, along with our limited government tradition to some extent, to the point where, I guess, to some of the points you brought up about the differences between private and public tyranny, or government tyranny or private tyranny. Are we headed for an entirely private social credit system here? Is it possible that wrong thinkers or people who have said something that the larger sort of left culture thinks is unforgivable? Do we think that this is not going to stop with big tech, right? It's not just some people dismiss this issue and say you have no right to a Twitter account. This isn't a big deal. This their platform. I mean, what happens then when it spreads beyond big tech to, I mean, are we looking at a future where if you say the wrong thing, you're not going to be able to have a bank account, not going to be able to use, Uber or Lyft, not going to be able to travel, on private companies that have all determined that you're just a dangerous wrong thinker? I mean, is that something that you think is a realistic fear in the United States?
But look, I really do, and I have really serious friends who share this fear that you just mentioned. I mean, obviously, the first weapon is that you become a non-entity online, and this is why, again, I think we need to get a handle on the potential for private tyranny. Is because, yes, I still have the legal right to go out there. I live in Manhattan, to go out, corner of 55th and Lex, and bang a drum saying, "Hey, everybody, Biden is corrupt." Dang, 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 dang. Yes, I can do that, and I won't get arrested, but I won't have much of an impact, and everyone will think I'm a nutter. So, if free speech is an actual, normative, real reality in American life, it happens on private platforms now. It happens on Facebook, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. And so, if an entity like Twitter or Facebook can shut down the country's fourth largest stories from the fourth largest newspaper by circulation, a paper that goes, almost to the founding of the country, then lots of other people will be silenced. And again, a lot of the silencing may even happen before people express their thoughts on these platforms, because again, coercion makes people react a certain way, and so they think, I should say that, so I just won't say it so that I can keep my Facebook account, keep in touch with my grandchildren. Other examples, as you know, some banks won't accept certain gun manufacturers and so forth as clients. Again, even though the right to bear arms is a fundamental right enshrined in our Constitution. So if that process expands, or if Bank of America says, out of a deep commitment to intersectionality, we just think that the Federalists can't bank with us, because of its. Now, there is a conservative tendency to be like, but we'll create our own parlay, or we will have our own banks, we will have our own platforms. But again, I think that's a mistake. That's a sort of relinquishing of vast swaths of public life. And so I think we need to be prepared to battle for the actual public square that we have, which is unfortunately deeply privatized, and to assert our constitutional rights in these environments. So we have to get legally and legislatively more creative than we have been. And it starts with getting over some of these kind of legalistic fictions between private and public.
Well, that's food for thought. Sarab, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Sorry, I ranted a lot and didn't let you talk much, but
no. That's the point. That's the point.
Okay.
Wanted to give you a chance to share this important story with our audience. Not just the story itself about the laptop, but how the New York Post has dealt with what seems to be an indication of a quite scary future to me, and I know to you as well. So thank you so much for coming on, and make sure to follow the New York Post and Sarab Ahmari on his Vanquish Foe Twitter. You can follow him there and follow his work, as well as at IWF, and Inez Felcher is my handle. Thank you to everybody who watched and participated, and hope to see you again. Until next time, we're signing off for now.